Thank you, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We are honored that today Professor Reetz is with us. Professor Reetz is Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Birmingham and affiliate Senior Research Fellow at the Centrum Modern Orient. His main area of research and teaching include non-Arabian Islam in the modern period in current century as well as the previous century, particularly in South Asia and South Asian countries, including Europe and other countries. Reetz graduated in international politics with a regional focus on South Asia and the Urdu language from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations in 1975 and did PhD in South Asian history at Humboldt University, Berlin. He published a number of research monographs and articles on the politics and history of South Asia, on ethnic and religious conflict, on Islamic groups and the concepts. He contributed to events related to Muslims and migration in Germany and wider Europe. And he has a lot of publication. And even he knows a good Urdu because he has mainly focused on the South Asian countries. So he believes that firstly we know the language. And you know that situation in South Asia and in perspective of Islam, that is quite complex. You know that, for example, in Pakistan, we face certain extremism in 80s, and still we are facing. Same, you know that like in India, whatever we face that India right now they are facing. They are religious, that is heavily politicized, and that is used. In Pakistan, we have certain right parties that are heavily involved in the politics. They have extreme street powers and extreme powers, but right now you know that they are not in mainstream politics. So I think that is a interesting lecture where you can link to politics, religion, and we have Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. Thank you. So over Reetz. Thank you.
Thank you so much. आपको बहुत शुक्रिया कि मुझे मौका मिला आपसे मीटअप करना और आपके साथ तो बातचीत करना तो जरूर हर दफा तो मैं भी कुछ तो ना कुछ सीखता हूँ इसलिए तो गुफ्तगू में रखा है मैं खास तौर पर आज के हालात में बहुत अपनी बात है. So what I'm trying to talk about today is that I want to invite you to differentiate the perspectives on the combination of politics and Islam. That is to engage with the differences in the terms and in their relationship, so that we do not have a very single-minded understanding of what political Islam means, trying to put it in the context of society in which Muslims live in South Asia. For this purpose, there are basically 3 points that I want to raise. What is political Islam as a term? Then I would argue it is important to have both the perspective of the believers and the perspectives from society. If the term political Islam is used today, it is often reduced to an almost pejorative and warning against radical and violent ideological interventions in the name of Islam. However, there I'm suggesting one needs to be cautious, meaning to say even political in this combination cannot be seen only in one meaning. For instance, political can be in this connection a political claim to power, influence, and control. It can also be perceived as a political threat in terms of security. But then what is often underestimated, politics very much relates also to the mode of ruling and governance, the way society is being organized and run, what type of system is being established and used. And it is particularly important and also relevant for Islam, also from the theological point of view, Why? Because if we compare Islam with the other Abrahamic religions like Judaism and Christianity, Islam, I often tell students, is a somewhat more or less secular religion. Why is that so? Because the founder of the religion, Muhammad, was the head of a government and founder of a state. Why? The argument was and is that Islam, in that sense, because the founder and the Prophet Muhammad was the founder of a government and a founder of a state. In that sense, it was important that when Islam was created, large number of verses of the Quran related to modes of governance, which is no coincidence because he was basically forced to deal with the system and make it running and make it working. So in that sense, it is no surprise and no coincidence that a large number of rules for running a government and running a system were also included both in the Quran and in the Hadith, and contained references for governance. And this established a system of governance early on. In this context, I think it's important to clarify that the term secular is not being used as la dunya, but as dunyavi, meaning to say as a combination, so to say, of the world with the perspective to what Muslims regard the hereafter, or to what they regard as the dini side of society. And the Muslim empire that in the following centuries applied Quranic references as rules and foundations of governance were, in a sense, following this double track as well, the theological track and the dunyavi, the, so to say, secular track that had started with the creation of the system of governance under Muhammad. And that brings us to the point of interpretation, which I think is an important, somewhat philosophical element and perspective in this discussion. And that's that every application or exercise of religious activity is a mode of interpretation. And every interpretation is selective. Why? Because there is no believer who can argue that he is in possession of the whole knowledge of the Quran and of the message of God. Otherwise, he would claim to be a prophet. But that has practical consequences. Practical consequences meaning every interpretation of Islam is selective. That would also mean that people who engage in the interpretation of Islam need to respect each other's selectiveness, because they themselves are not better than the others, because they themselves are also only selective. So they themselves are selective, others are also selective. So there is an importance of engaging with each other about these selections and the selectiveness and what we mean by it when we engage with it. That did have consequences for the system of governance in terms of the legal system. Why? Because this manifold interpretations led also to the situation where the Islamic law by muftis was interpreted in very different ways. As you know yourself, not in the Middle Ages, but even today, this led to a situation where people went around from one mufti to another until they got the fatwa they wanted. And interestingly enough, this kind of flexibility in the legal system is in a sense absent from the Western system, because it's very limited to particular enforcing to particular single notions of an interpretation that are relevant and are applied in a particular local context. So it's important for understanding, so to say, this fluidity, to keep this in mind, as this has also practical consequences for the way communities are living, have been living, and have been dealing with each other, how conflicts from that arose, how options emerged to negotiate these conflicts. And these interpretations also remained influential in making political claims, and they created a wide spectrum of options for this purpose, where Muslims were engaging in it until today. Besides the law and interpretation, there's also another structural intervention, so to say, in this issue of political Islam, and that is the global element, the global perspective. And again, we have two elements here. One is that Islam as a theology per se, of course, is making a global claim, as it is argued that there is the understanding that the world is already Islamic, it doesn't know it yet. So that's why Dawah is done to basically inform people of this situation in what they allegedly or supposedly are. But then on the dunyavi, on the secular side, I mean, the Islamic and Muslim system is also global because its institutions and structures have become their own subsystem of secular globalization, what we could call from the global south, because very often networks of Muslim institutions from the early beginnings have been used also concurrently for trading connections, for student exchanges, for family connections, and so on. And that is not surprising because it also happened in other cultures and happened in other religions, Christianity, for instance, where trading came up largely in connection with the Lutheran sects and certain Protestant sects that were kind of involved in the Netherlands and in Switzerland, for instance, in the Middle Ages and so on. So this combination of the religious and the social is very normal, and it continues to exist today. What does it mean for today's perspective? That it means that in the South Asian context, for instance, the political parties and the maslaks, the sectarian orientations, can also not be reduced to a single identity. Every one of them has very different modes of political or public engagements. Take, for instance, the Jamaat Islam, which is often argued is the most political of the Islamic parties and groups in South Asia. That is primarily so because Maududi, who was well aware of the government history of Medina, made the governance a major element and condition for the implementation of Islamic rules in the world in preparation for the hereafter. While this intention distinguished the party from other groups, such as the Jamaat-ul-Ulema Hind, it did not and does not mean that the Jamaat followers all make the identical claims and arguments. And the range of their arguments and claims is, for instance, coming from civil society with almost left-leaning mobilization of the Haktu movement in Gwadar under Maulana Hidayatul Rahman, to center-right politics of the GI under Siraj al-Haq in the provincial government of KP, the militant interventions of the Hizbul Islam in Kashmir, grassroots activism of women activists of the Indian Jamaat Islamic student organization SIO, for which became famous Ladida Sakhalun and Ayesha Rena in their demonstration in Delhi, or conservative traditional resistance politics of the Jamaat Islami in Bangladesh, where they are a conservative, so to say, opponent embodied in the JEI slogan Bangladesh Banega, Afghanistan. And I was lucky to basically be an observer and a participant in some of such events when I visited India, for instance, and I was invited by the Islamic Student Organization to their Islamic conference, which was a rather, a very academic conference, where the emphasis on theological aspects was very limited, I must say, and where there was a very strong engagement with, in a sense, classical, academic, historical, and political studies and understandings of society and developments in India today. So what we see is that these sectarian orientations are some sort of a life world in themselves. And that's why in one of my articles, which I published in 2010, Alternate Globalities, I call a maslak called a religio cultural meal. And why a meal? There is literature which calls a milieu a world arranged and structured according to the predispositions of the actor. That means there is some differentiation in the milieu, but at the same time, there's something that combines them together, which creates a life world of their own. So we have the very interesting kind of situation that these maslaks on one side get more and more differentiated in themselves, but on the other side, their structure, the way they operate, becomes more and more similar between them. Why? Because all these maslaks nowadays have a center of a theology, a women's organization, a student organization. They have also militant groups or violent groups in one or the other way, engaged in one or the other form. So this sort of internal structure has still somehow become more or less similar, making them, so to say, adaptable to a somewhat global faith market situation. That can even also be seen, for instance, in the Salafi. For instance, there's quite a difference between the way the Al-Hadith doctrine is applied even by communities in South Asia, which has long by academic scholars and researchers been identified with three different tracks. One, the traders, two, the scholars, and three, militants. And these in themselves, these tracks have formed separate communities. Sometimes they were connected, but often on a personal level, not necessarily on an ideological level. And some of them were separate, existing in different cities, in different places, with very little connection with them. Or we take the way how the Salafi term is being used in Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's a huge difference between the way the scholars use it and the government. And they clash on a large number of issues to be implemented, how to be implemented, what to do about it in regular life, in economies, in legal affairs, and so on. And still, there's another track in the West, the Salafi of the young second generation of Muslims who do not want to identify anymore with the ethnic Islam of their parent generation and have somehow created this sort of Salafi mosques, which are known for attracting these guys. They are also very active, the preachers there on the social media. And unfortunately, some of these communities, some of these Western Salafi mosques for these immigrant origin, second and third generation Muslim, they had also connections with the Islamic State system. We know that this modernist reinvention of the Salafi understanding also is extending in the social media to Pakistan, with some of the friends and colleagues who are currently even present here. We had discussed this, that there is increasing number of preachers on the social media who are also attracting an ever-growing following in Pakistan, outside of the conventional maslaks, and creating, so to say, a purified Salafi understanding of their own, that is, in a sense, creating a different take on the issue of religiosity, and also public and political claims emerging from it. Similar distinctions, I mean, equally strong distinctions are well known for the Deobandis. We have the great and well-known factions, the political faction following Madani, and the more Sufi-oriented faction following Tanavi, who must be known for you. The Deobandi in the West are often identified with the Taliban, yet we know that the Deobandi do not endorse militancy per se, but interpreted it in particular local and political context. We know that from the Began with Pakistan initiative that has been primarily also supported by Deobandi scholars, by Mufti Taqi Usmani in particular. And he was the one who went even to Kabul to trying to convince the Taliban not to oppose education for women. And that was understood to be still acceptable and even integrated into the system of the Deobandi madrasas. And not only in a small way, because if we look at South Asia, India and Pakistan, for instance, the number of girl madrasas in the established madrasas is rising enormously. The number of girl students in these madrasas, where I visited a couple of places, is even higher than the number of boy students in those madrasas. In some of them, maybe in India more than in Pakistan, I don't know, but I also know that in Pakistan, the number of girl students in madrasas is substantial, which will and ultimately does have also social consequences for the families in which they are living. And similar distinctions can be tracked for the Bareilwis, which is a broad spectrum. On one side, there are the shrines. Then they have their own traditional madrasas with a formalized curriculum, which somehow emerged in competition with the Deobandis since the early 20th century. We have a modernist religious school, the Minhaj al-Quran, which is providing, so to say, a comparatively modern, updated education output in terms of public education also, in addition with religious knowledge. We also have street violence, and we have political participation by both by TLP activists. Another element which intervenes in the differentiation of these groups are the conventional or traditional secular political ideologies. For instance, why is that important to understand? Because the mobilization about which we are currently talking has largely taken its roots from the 18th and 19th century, notably for South Asia, when these groups were among those who were trying to engage with the influence of British colonialism and of Christianity to, in some sort of identity politics, to kind of trying to find a new identity for the people living in India. And we had parallel processes at that time among the Hindus. That's how basically this Hindu movement was arising. We had parallel processes in the Sikh movement, but not only in the religious ones, also the Tamil movement, for instance, went through similar stages of development. And we can still, if we look at these groups, track and trace these secular political ideologies, nationalism, for instance, in the Pakistan movement of Muslim nationalism under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, socialism, the peaceful version in the Islamic socialism of Barakatullah and Ubaidullah Sindhi, the more violent version of it in the Mujahideen colonies in Buna and Bajaur, where they were experimenting as utopian communities and proto-communist imaginations under Fazl-e-Ilahi Razirabadi. The Green Movement, ethical capitalism through the Islamic economy system, the halal industry, conferences being held in Malaysia and Pakistan, liberalism, yet another track, for instance, having international conferences on Islam and liberty, and conservatism, traditionalism, often embodied or seen as being embodied by the ulema movement and their political parties. Here you can see the info for the International Islamic Economic System Conference. And it is, I'm saying again, important to re-emphasize this and open the eyes to this, because this is kind of estimated in research and in coverage, even though the systems continue existing and are very active and are also economically active. For instance, they have, for instance, the Islamic economic system, they have created their own uh, um, system of money deposits and of deposits. And interestingly enough, the most influential financial system for this kind of money arrangement is London. So this shows the interaction with these kind of different formats. I was again attracted, or how to say, I got informed about this kind of differentiation when I was asked to head one panel in one of these Islam and Liberty conferences that a couple of years ago were held in Islamabad at the International Islamic University, where I learned about this separate system. In these structural interventions, what also plays an enormous role is communication. And here again, we see a lot of differentiation. There are groups which are more emphasizing the text and the literal interpretation of words and letters and what's been written. There are more modernist groups which engage more in public debates and are more emphasizing the mode of speaking. And there are like the groups of the Sufis and the Barelvis who are more emphasizing emotional rituals as part of the process of identifying with the particular orientation in Islam, or on the other hand, with public claims. Conclusion. We are seeing here diverse perspectives, meaning to say this is neither to say that the groups and activists mentioned are actually only following Western ideologies. This is also not to say that those Muslim groups diverge from the original first generation Salafi objectives of Islam. This is to draw attention to the diversity of perspectives on the political identity of actors and institutions and their programs and actions. It is argued, therefore, that political Islam can neither from the Western nor from the believer's perspective be reduced to one particular meaning only. It is neither the privilege of one particular Islamic party or group to act politically, nor is the political acting uniform. It is therefore rather important to contextualize and analyze the objectives and real actions from both perspectives. And in this connection, what obtains more recently, also in the Pakistan context, more importance is an aspect also very little discussed, that is functionality and delivery. New mobilization does not necessarily relate to the ideology with which it claims to be connected. For instance, in Gwadar, it is neither religious nor ethnic movement, but driven by the lack of functionality and delivery by the state and the economy. The same, some argue, applies to the PTM and KP province, which is less driven by the large argument of Pashtun nationalism, but more again by the lack of functionality and delivery in the Fata region, which has not seen sufficient delivery of services and institutions after the merger, and which is still facing a number of obstructions, which are ultimately from the ground, from the bottom, the elements which push the relevance and significance of these groups even more than their ideological claims. That also applies to the larger regional context, including Afghanistan, where the Taliban's success to a significant extent was owed to the lack of functionality and delivery of the previous system under Ghani, and which now the Taliban have to face themselves. So this functionality and delivery are now becoming some sort of an objective where political Islam turns more and more into an attempt to improve society. And it can improve society as much as it can damage it, which ultimately depends on the people involved in their immediate actions on the ground and their contextualized objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And it was very heartening to see that what you have developed an idea about Islam from the outside is very comprehensive as compared to us sitting, like being a Muslim ourselves, born Muslim, versus your understanding. My quick question, or I would like to impart from you, and we have talked about it in the initial presentation as well, about the interpretation and how there were difference in terms of how you take different Quranic interpretations. Do you think that there was some role in terms of the rulers who were basically looking after the affairs of the government at that time, that influenced in terms of what suits them in terms of a particular interpretation or an adoption of a trade which they should be carrying out? And does it still operates that there is some group actually which is trying to develop a kind of its own explanation of things so that he or she or as a group they can take advantage of it? This
I mean, in the sense that that applies also what I try to explain. I mean, there will always be attempts on the part of the people in power to influence the interpretation. But what has in the past, at least in the founding era, and also under the Muslim empires, and even today in Saudi Arabia being the case, and it's still also the case in Pakistan, there is also a clear distinction between these two perspectives, and they cannot be easily reduced to one. And the people in charge of the governance system, it also varied. There is not the same impact or influence on decision making from the religious side. In fact, they have often rather been unable to influence this kind of narrative, and so they're still in many ways remained a parallel track, where of course the power configuration was one element, and then they tried to sell it as Islamic, so to say, but then the debates and the arguments and the interaction on the level of the religious side among the muftis or the scholars was another track, and could not be easily always reconciled. So that kind of dynamic always existed. But you see, if you look at it from the larger perspective of traditional political science, from where I'm actually coming from originally, it means that you have such binary constructs in every system, also in the West and on the Christians. I mean, there is no space in public and in politics which is free of ideology. The question is only what you understand by ideology. What is your concept? And you see these kind of struggles today in Britain. You see that in the UK. You can also see it in Germany or in Russia and China. There is almost always a tension between ideology and the mode of governance, how to run a system, what is the emphasis on delivery and functionality. For instance, I mean, just a take on this issue, which is underestimated delivery and functionality between the competition between the US and China. There is now a strong competition on functionality and delivery because China, irrespective of its very ideological system, has managed to implement a lot of functionality and delivery in the system by, for instance, digitizing. I mean, I heard from friends that you can nowadays do a driving license totally digitally. You don't even have to go to any place to drive a car. It's all done digitally, right to the point where the performer is issued. In the US, for instance, that is by far not the case. And I mean, US actually is undermined now trying to reinvest in their functionality and delivery because they realize that there is a gap. So that is, so to say, a political and economic competition level, which is in political science, I think, and in social science, somewhat underestimated today.
Well, thanks, sir, for coming and joining us. Sir, I will go give a thought from your continuous class in third last report of slides. You said some good facts about Mufti Taqi Usmani science. And I think the ground realities are different from something that we are seeing from outside, from the foreign countries. I think in Pakistani madrasas or Pakistani communities, you cannot do anything without the approval of Mufti Taqi Usmani Sahib. And everything, the curriculum is made up by Taqi Sahib, and the whole Islamic banking is the head of the whole Islamic banking system. And he is known as the father of the Sharia in our country. So I think the ground realities are much different. You can randomly open any book of Islamic teachings or madrasas. I think there is some biasness, perhaps the ground realities are much different because randomly if you open any book or anything, I don't think so there is any good fact about PLP or PPM or other the racism or Sufism or other things. They just say that follow the right path. There are exceptions in any, you say, for example, you give us examples of the Usman. There are also other people who are not doing good. So there are exceptions, but I think overall the system is not that much bad.
Well, you see, I don't want to be seen as defending the Deobandi system. That is not my argument. My argument is saying that there is a differentiation between, for instance, what some people say in the name of the Deobandi system, like the Taliban, and what others say, like Mufti Usmani. And I don't think also he can be equally made, so to say, responsible for the mode of action in every single of these madrasas. First of all, you are talking about the Deobandi madrasa. There's also the Barelvi madrasa. So he's obviously not the reference point for the Barelvi madrasa. At the same time, I still know in the Deobandi system, also in Pakistan, the madrasas following, let's say, the Tanavi section and orientation, they still keep their not independence, but kind of their own approach to a number of issues in daily life. So there, when we are focusing on him, this is one mode of interpretation of many. But in the media, of course, he is perceived as the one and only reference. But in the sense, you're right, in practicality, there's a large number of different groups, there's a large number of different institutions, and they do not necessarily always go along with what he says, you know. But even in the larger sense, the Deobandi system, the schools do not apply education in the same way. For instance, you may know about the Iqra school system. That is, for instance, comparatively modern, where, for instance, public instruction is taught at a comparatively high level, something as compared to the Minhaj al-Quran schools, for instance. So again, a differentiation, you know, where you cannot say one has to contextualize the particular institution and activity at which one is looking. One cannot generalize it. Not even in one of these maslaks. So one really needs to look, okay, what are they doing and how does that actually interact with practical society?
I have done my middle from the university system as well.
Okay.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much, Professor. It was really very exciting to listen to your thesis. Based on my live understanding of the things, because I'm not an expert of it, keeping in view the perspective of past 150 years. So I'm not talking about the early Islam. I'm talking about how this Islam is being manifest in this part of the world. I mean to say the subcontinent in the past 150 years. From where I see it, it looks like that it is not about the indigenous theologies or the interpretations of Islam that was happening here. It looks to me that West has been teaching us how to interpret Islam in the past 150 years. like from the famous conspiracy of the British, whereby the certain divisions were being facilitated by the British Raj. That is one example. And more recently, in the broader geopolitical situation, we were told that jihad is the most important thing. Mainly, it apparently looks like that it is our version, but it was more of an American version, whereby they required to have some support against the Russian atrocities in Afghanistan. So the Mujahideens, and then we were told by the West again that these Mujahideens are actually terrorists, and we started believing it. Same as we believe that we are doing a war in the name of Allah in the G80s. And now, at the start of the 21st century, we started believing that jihad is more of a terrorism act. So, as a belief of most of the people who are sitting here, jihad is no more a job that is sacred in nature, and any act of violence is a terrorism act. So, this thing is being taught to us by the West, at least in the past 150 years. So, what do you say about it? Especially, I would like to know about your perspective or my interpretation of things. What do you say about it?
Well, you see, while it is true that these arguments were being made, I'm somewhat skeptical about reducing it to one mode of interaction only, because if you take a more global perspective of history, you will find similar trends in the West as well, parallel in time. I mean, the developments how in the 19th century kind of nationalism developed, how then the First World War came into being, then how communism emerged, and how, I mean, Nazism emerged, the populist nationalism of Hitler. I mean, they were kind of trends that were copied in other parts of the world. That is not something that, how to say, the British were sitting down and say, okay, now you have to, I mean, Maududi was not in that sense shown what sort of books he should write. And on the contrary, people like Martin, they were interned for some time because of their resistance. On the contrary, one could even argue, I mean, was what I was trying to argue, their mobilization was some sort of anti-colonial response. I mean, it was not the result of being taught, it was a result. Yes, it was a result of being taught and thinking it's not the right thing they're being taught, because they thought that this has to be confronted with something else. And so, in the sense, the Western interventions led to counter mobilizations, led to reactions, responses. And in that sense, I see these movements rather more what I call it sometimes as proto-nationalist movements. I mean, normally it is assumed that nationalism is a secular, non-religious movement, but actually in these regions here and largely in the global south, in the late colonial period, very often proto-nationalism was advocated in the name of identity. And identity was either religious or ethnic, and therefore you had Pashtun movement, you had Tamil movement. They did not arise because the British told them to do it. On the contrary, the British were scared of them. So these were modes and ways to express their identity and their frustration about the way things were being run. So in that sense, I would rather see it in the opposite way of what you have proposed.
Part of my question has already been answered, but I would still like you to talk a bit more about this. Talking about this multiple interpretations of Islam, from what I have read and from what I have listened from different sources, multiple interpretations of Islam have always existed. There are as many examples of people being persecuted for their opposite interpretation as there are of people who've been accepted to exist within Ottoman Empire and Fatimid Empire. There are so many examples where different and marginalized interpretations of Islam have been allowed to exist. I personally think that this obsession with the singular interpretation, one uniform monolithic interpretation of Islam is pretty much a product of the modern and the modernity and the ways in which modern nation state is structured. I would like you to talk a bit more about this. Thank you.
I mean, it has to do, of course, with a lot of power. I mean, if one of these actors coming from an Islamic background has the chance to be involved in power claims, then of course he will claim that his interpretation is the only right one. I mean, that is because that is part of any political game, because you cannot, in terms of functionality and delivery, you cannot claim power or come to power if you are coming to power and saying, no, what I am saying maybe is actually wrong, because maybe my competitor is actually right, and you will not be able to claim power. I mean, and that is not confined to religious things only. I mean, we can see it now with Imran Khan. I mean, his claim is that he is the only one who's right. But so is the opposite. I mean, so is the government. So the PMLN, I mean, if they do not make the claim, how they can then argue that it's them who need to rule the country? So of course, their claim to being the only one who is right needs obviously to be challenged by the other side, and in a way which is, transparent and accessible to people.
आप उर्दू भी समझते हैं और मेरी अपनी ज़बान भी उर्दू है
हाँ,
इस वजह से मैं आपसे उर्दू में सवाल
उम्मीद है कि मैं समझ नहीं सका, अगर नहीं तो कोई दूसरा आदमी तो मुझे भी मदद दे सकता है।
नहीं कोई बात नहीं, आप इंग्लिश में जवाब दे सकते हैं, लेकिन मैं सवाल उर्दू में करूँगा। पहले ये था कि जो आपने कहा था कि बांग्लादेश बनेगा अफगानिस्तान, इसको आप थोड़ा सा एक्सप्लेन करें। और सेकंड क्वेश्चन मेरा ये है कि जो कॉलोनियल कंस्ट्रक्ट था, जो ब्रिटिश यहाँ पे हुकूमत कर रहे थे, तो उन्होंने किस तरह कॉलोनियल कंस्ट्रक्ट या कॉलोनियल इंपीरियलिज्म को सामने रखते हुए रिलीजन को उन्होंने, जो चाहे हिंदुइज्म था चाहे इस्लाम था, उनको किस तरह से डील किया। तो और नंबर थर्ड मेरा अपना पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू ये है कि जो ये पावर के लिहाज से अगर हम देखें तो पावर के लिहाज से कई ऐसे, फॉर एग्जाम्पल इंडिया में अगर आप बीजेपी के साथ आरएसएस को देखें, यहाँ पाकिस्तान में आप देखें मुख्तलिफ वगैरह, तो पावर के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हम इन पार्टियों को या इन ग्रुप्स को या इन उसको बयान नहीं कर सकते हैं।
I'm not fully sure I got the points. I'm sorry if someone can help me, because
Sir, my first question was
First is that how Bangladesh can become.
yes, no, I think that one I got that easily. So
second one,
sorry,
that-
just to not to get confused, because that's different. I just come
And
to
second-
that
second-
because I think in the Bangladesh context, we know the Jamaat Islami has become some sort of, and is playing itself out as a victim of the political system. So, and they are also partly being tracked and traced for that reason. And also, as we know, they have been partly involved in the 1971 resistance. So they were partly also connected with resisting the independence of Bangladesh. So that creates a political environment in which they kind of end up in a political and ideological corner that puts them in a rather conservative, almost aggressive kind of position where they are trying to defend their existence, which is a very different frame as it would exist or does exist in Pakistan, or as it does exist in India, where, so to say, the Jamaat Islam system has become a very open kind of citizen sort of civil society sort of system. So this concrete political context in which they operate has an enormous impact in the way and the mode these groups operate. Yeah, it was notably the second question I didn't fully understand.
Second question was when
Sir,
British-
I will
yeah.
say no problem. My second question was that is like British ruled here, so how they deal the Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. For example, there are different that they tried to modernize these religions. So please explain this point that how they deal religion in South Asia.
I got that point, but I was confused. I'm still confused by the question a bit because there is not a single system as such. I mean, they were treating, in a sense, religious institutions as religious institutions. What we did is, for instance, in the different colonies where the British came, they also to some extent looked at the existing legal systems which existed before, and then they tried to integrate them in order to get more support. For instance, that led to the situation that in the Indian context, they created the Muslim Law Act, the first one in the 30s. But parallel also local traditional law was formalized and accepted. So that's why South Asia is one of the peculiar situations where from a legal perspective, you can have legal interactions on 3 different levels: Western law, religious law, and local traditional law, and all is formally recognized. So that kind of relates to the way how the British were dealing with the local systems in the countries over which they have control. Because they were, in terms of numbers, ability, they were very small. So what they were trying to do is to include the elites and to kind of get support from the elites. And for this purpose, they were looking very closely at how the local culture was operating so that they can use that, so they can employ that and integrate that. That is basically all that I can say at the moment. The Christian groups came from outside, so they did not have, I don't think, any separate special status. Even there was competition among them, and there was also, I don't know, I don't think a particular structural protectionism. One could not necessarily say so. For instance, they were comparatively open to religious institutions of all orientation. Why I'm saying that, for instance, they used madrasa system in the early 20th century, even giving public money to them as a mode of education in the Bengal area, which is still still existing in Bangladesh. The same institution. Their roots were laid during the colonial period. So then some people would say, from the left, they might say, so yeah, but the British, they are at fault. I mean, they just created the madrasa system there. No, they just try to make use of all the existing institutions as long as they were supporting, so to say, their system of rule and governance. And that they were trying to formalize and integrate all into a larger, complex kind of legal and governance system. And the third question was?
I say that in the context of power, like RSS and BJP, there a government in the Modi government. Similarly, here in Pakistan, we see that AI government. So we cannot explain the political Islam is in the context of power or getting power share in the government.
So I still don't know.
So I'm saying that different parties, different religious parties, they are trying to gain share in the government.
Yes.
In the form of ministries, etc.
Yes.
Like so, we cannot explain the political Islam in the context of power gaining.
Oh, you mean that should also be considered? Of course, I mean, sure, the religious party that exists in Pakistan and that also exists in India. I mean, there is also a claim to become part of the power system. Obviously, no doubt about that. But in Pakistan, as we know, I mean, the share of the religious parties in parliament has been not very strong and has been, how to say, limited. And this share of the religious party mandates in parliament in Pakistan has not actually changed radically over the years. So it is somehow fluctuating between 5, 10 to maximum 15%, perhaps. No, I don't think below 10%. In that sense, this religious claim to power has not really been significantly successful, I would say. But it is normal that political parties do it. That's what they are created for. Yeah, that's true. I mean, Modi was using the political, I mean, the religious party argument, I mean, the religious identity argument largely as a populist thing, because actually he was originally an RSS activist, so he knew the system very well. And there is one, from a political science perspective in India, there's one additional factor which has to be considered. That is the RSS and the BJP gave the Modi system the chance to mobilize the lower income and low education section of the Hindu society, which otherwise was totally inaccessible. So that is also, you see, a functional issue, because interestingly enough, Modi is also the one, I mean, his government is the one which is having the closest relation with the big Indian companies, with the big money, on the other hand. So that's why sometimes they call him, also Pakistan analysts call him the two-engine government, because you see he is, so to say, accessing support in two different sides. I mean, Imran Khan has tried to do something similar with his state of Medina thing, but the problem is it was not so convincing. And Modi is more convincing because Modi was a real practitioner of this sort of, I mean, he grew up in the system as an activist, whereas Imran Khan made the argument that the advantage of the state of Medina is something what he got the information in Oxford when he was growing up there. So that's of course a difference.
Professor Reetz, thanks a lot. That was a wonderful discussion. And I hope in future, I'm sorry, today when you came, would face some uncertainty because you know that there is a potential threat of strike. So that's why the student have to left because bus is left at 2:30. So that's why, unfortunately, it was done at the 11th hour. So I hope, inshallah, in future we will serve you in a better way. This was beyond our control.